Hi, this is Bob Wells here, and welcome to Undercurrent Stories. This is the show where we hear about people's interests and uncover some fascinating stories at the same time. I hope you enjoy today's show. In today's show, I'm joined by James Albon. James is an award-winning British illustrator and author of graphic novels. He studied illustration at Edinburgh College of Art and went on to a postgraduate scholarship at the Royal Drawing School in London. He was awarded the Gwen May Award from the Royal Society of Painter-Printmakers in 2012, and he was a finalist in the Observer, Cape, Comica Graphic Short Story Prize in 2017 for his comic Madame Aimée. James's illustrations clients include the Folio Society, The Guardian and the Wall Street Journal, and he's just brought out his latest graphic novel, which I actually finished last night, thoroughly enjoyed it, called The Delicacy. Hello and welcome to the show, James.
Hi, how's it going?
It's good, thank you. Yeah, I tell you, this is a nice early interview. I enjoy these early interviews.
Yeah, I always find I have to get talking early in the day. Otherwise, I'll sort of spend the entire day thinking about what I'm going to say, and then I'll be overwhelmed with sort of stage pressure when we actually start recording. So it's good to be recording early in the morning. It's
a good tip. Yeah, just a few exercises for the mouth, I think, first thing.
Yeah. I had my sort of my breakfast glass of whiskey, and now I'm ready to go.
Are you coming from Scotland?
Yeah, so I'm sitting up here in Edinburgh just now.
Okay, yeah. Great. Anyways, it's great to have you on. So how have things been for you over the last sort of 18 months or so?
Things have been fine, actually. I feel almost a little guilty about sort of saying this because obviously, the pandemic has been so terrible for so many people, and especially on a professional level, a lot of my friends who were sort of actors or musicians have really sort of struggled. Yeah. Whereas as a self-employed illustrator, I was already working from home. I've got a little studio set up in my flat, and actually, I work remotely with all my clients already, and everything just sort of ticked along. It was just that all the restaurants were closed, so I kind of didn't have anything to do in the evenings. But it was actually been really we haven't been too adversely affected, I would say.
That's good. Yeah, it's been tough for a lot of people, but I think you're right. I think others have had it quite. I wouldn't say easy, but it has. Yeah, it's made a huge amount of difference.
Yeah. It's been really unfair, the sort of unpredictability of who's been affected by it. And then even, especially not just people who've had their lifestyles affected, but people whose health have been affected, obviously.
Yeah, exactly. So, they're terrible. Anyway, before we talk about your latest book, could you just, please tell us a bit about your life's journey and how you became a freelance illustrator, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I work as an illustrator. My life's journey has been fairly straightforward in a way. Despite my lack of accent, I actually grew up in the northeast of Scotland. Oh, yeah. And then when I was 18, went to Edinburgh College of Art, where I studied illustration. I think drawing has always been this tremendous passion of mine. Like quite often people will sort of say, when did you start drawing? And to me, it's like I started when I was like 2 or whatever. I started as soon as I could hold a crayon, as everyone does. And I think that it's just that, most people reach an age where they kind of stop drawing for fun. And for me, that never happened, and I went from drawing for fun kind of to drawing as a profession. Yeah. So through studying illustration at Edinburgh College of Art, and then sort of traveled around after that, worked as a freelance illustrator in the editorial world. And then a few years later, I went to the Royal Drawing School in London, where I got really into graphic novels. And that's when I sort of wrote and illustrated my first graphic novel. Yeah. So that was back in 2015, and now here we are.
So most people have an idea about what an illustrator does, but could you just go into a bit more detail on what that sort of work involves, please?
Yeah, it's a funny question, actually. I think often I find if I talk to, especially say, I don't know, like my dad's friends, family friends at like a Christmas gathering or something, and I tell people I'm an artist or an illustrator, they immediately get an impression of what I do, and it's immediately the wrong impression. Especially if you tell people that you're an artist, they think I'm sort of like oil painting and cutting my ear off and that sort of thing. Basically, there's 2 main strands to my work. I work in graphic novels, so that's writing and illustrating these sort of extensive, fully illustrated books, sort of comic book type things. And then I also work as an editorial illustrator, doing illustrations for newspapers and magazines. And they're really interesting sort of contrasting professional worlds, because as a graphic novelist, you take on these projects that take 2 or 3 years, like from the initial researching and developing ideas for a script and kind of coming up with the bare bones right through to illustrating every single page. that whole process takes years. Whereas in editorial illustration, an art director from a newspaper sends you an article, and they're like, you have 48 hours to illustrate this.
So you've got a very tight deadline.
So it's suddenly these really, really tight deadlines, and they're often very sort of conceptual stories, which I find really, really interesting.
Yeah.
So for me, those two balance each other out really, really well. I think it would be, in a way, exhausting to just do these quick, 48-hour, 24-hour turnarounds week upon week without anything longer to work on.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think it would be sort of exhausting in a different way almost if you just had these like nothing but 2-year projects to work on where you kind of don't see the end very clearly.
Yeah.
Like the nice thing about doing an editorial illustration is you finish the work and then it's like printed in a newspaper the next day. So you kind of have this really real sense of completion.
Yes.
Whereas with a graphic novel, you finish the book and then it takes 9 months to come out or something. And then sometimes I sort of find myself, people ask like, so what were your initial ideas when you started the book? And I think, man, that was 3 years ago. I don't really remember what my initial ideas were.
So when a magazine or a newspaper gives you something, gives you a project to work on, they commission you to do something. Is it do they give you a tight prescriptive sort of format in terms of what they want, or do they leave it to you?
Normally, they really leave it up to the illustrator, so which is really nice, and especially because a lot of the time, a magazine or a newspaper will be commissioning illustration when the story is something that has a kind of conceptual edge that you can't really show in a photograph. So, for example, just last week, actually, I had these two back-to-back 24-hour deadlines with this French newspaper called Libération.
Yeah.
One of the stories was a philosopher writing about kind of the concept of home in the modern age. And the other story was about sort of the negative health effects of teenagers using too much TikTok. And they're both really interesting stories, but they're both really, really different. And they're both things where you kind of can't, a newspaper could show the article alongside a photograph of like a teenager on their phone, but it doesn't really get the psychological aspect across, So I think that's the thing that's really exciting about being an illustrator is tackling those sorts of kind of conceptually complicated subjects.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's also really funny because it means you're doing these two really short jobs where you're really like changing gears between two really different kinds of stories. So for me, that's quite exhilarating. That's the kind of, the exhilarating side of being an editorial illustrator.
Sorry to interrupt you there. Yeah, no, totally get that. I mean, as I say, I think for me, if somebody said to me, you need to illustrate something, and I'm not an artist, by the way, I gave up when I started arts when I did art at school, and I thought, it's not for me anyway. But no, if somebody said to me, do something about the mental effects of somebody, a teenager on TikTok too much, I would just probably think of a picture of a teenager in his bedroom or her bedroom with a phone. You have to sort of get more than that. So what type of things? What were your thought processes in developing that idea?
I think that sort of thinking about these visual metaphors or these sort of concepts it is something that you really train. And it's funny because I think people can often, the notion of like practicing kind of the surface of drawing, like making you can draw a nice realistic apple sitting on a table and you can make it more and more realistic looking and get the shadows just right and the shine just right and stuff. And that's something you can sit down and practice. If you drew an apple every day for a year, you'd just get really good at drawing apples.
Yeah.
Finding that conceptual side of developing images is also something you just practice. But it's just that the process of practicing it maybe isn't as obvious to an outsider. But I think what I tend to do, regardless of the project, is really just sit down and think. There's a lot of list making, a lot of sort of making notes, and then drawing out these really little sort of thumbnail sketches of all the different kind of literal or conceptual elements that relate to the story. And then finding interesting ways to combine them. Because, of course, because it's not a photograph, you can include any number of things next to each other and give them their own relationships in the drawing. So, for example, on this illustration about the concept of a house that I did last week, there's sort of relatively realistic drawings of all the things that go into this guy's house, all the furniture and everything. But they're stacked within a sort of, like a kind of square on a triangle kind of child's shape, just idea of a house rather than being like a literal drawing of a house. Oh, okay. And contrasting those sorts of things, I find really, really interesting. So, so it's definitely a process of practicing coming up with the concepts as well as practicing making them look beautiful.
Yeah. That sounds very interesting. And how did you? What did the teenager with too much TikTok? What did that come out like?
Oh, that came out actually kind of similar to what you're describing. Actually, it's we went through a couple of different versions. I mean, in these editorial jobs, you always send multiple roughs, so multiple like rough sketches, so that the art director has a bit of choice.
Yeah.
And there was a question about whether the article should focus on sort of the positive social sides of TikTok, which involve, like, for example, one of the ideas was like there's a teenager kind of standing up on their phone, and opposite them there's like a phone as tall as they are, and they're stepping into it to meet like a world of friends who live inside the phone.
Yes.
Which shows it in a sort of fairly positive light. There was one that was about the sort of the fame and celebrity that people, some TikTok followers will have like 1 million followers and make big money out of doing that as well.
Yeah.
So we had like a giant sort of theater auditorium with like a giant phone on the stage and this like celebrity TikToker on this like opera stage.
Oh, okay.
With the crowd going wild. But then actually, the one we went for in the end, I thought, what if we really just we had this teenager in their room on their phone, but they're really lit in a way that suggests that they're like hypnotized by their phone, and it's one of the sides of the article was this sort of story that it becomes like a drug and it really affects teenagers' self-esteem. And the interesting thing with this particular article is that it's like a charity in France where they get young people to write firsthand about their various social issues, and then they kind of collate them.
Yeah.
So there's lots of different perspectives in the article, and some of them are saying like, oh, I've got so many followers and I made so much money. And then others are saying, oh, I find myself just getting hooked onto TikTok for 3 hours a night and it's really having a bad effect on my mental health. Yeah. And you see this sort of breadth of perspectives. But in the end, we went to this one that's like about this sort of hypnotic effect of TikTok.
Yeah.
That was a lot of fun to illustrate, and I'll send you the images so you can keep them alongside the
if you're happy
alongside the podcast.
Put them on,
absolutely.
If you put them on the show notes, perhaps, so people can see what we've been talking about. That's
absolutely.
Obviously, the work that you do is freelance based.
Mm-hmm.
How do you have you actually ever been employed by somebody full time in art?
I haven't had what you might call a real job in such a long time.
I didn't want to say that.
Yeah. No, it's true. I say it all the time. I mean, when I was starting out, especially when you're sort of, starting out as an artist, it can be quite difficult to make a living. And I'd always have a job in a shop or a job in a bar or something to to help pay rent. And I always hated it. I was just like, even I'm such a child, like even a sensible, ordinary thing that I was already about to do, if a manager comes over and is like, oh, James, could you go and like sort that out? I'm like, oh, no. So I'm really bad at sort of having a regular boss. So I love working freelance in that way. The way it works in Illustrator is you sort of send out what we call mail out. So you send out either sort of postcards with examples of your work or emails, increasingly emails nowadays, to potential clients. So that would be like magazines, newspapers, design agencies, book publishers, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you sort of establish a rapport with the art directors there. Kind of get to know them, get them to know your work. And then that tends to hopefully lead to them commissioning you. So a couple of times a week, I'll get an email from an art director who'll say like, oh, are you interested? Here's an article. Are you interested in illustrating it? And then the jobs go from there.
Yeah. So we've discussed the sort of conceptual side and the idea side of how you would put something across and illustrate it. Mm-hmm. In terms of technically, is it all done on computer now? Is it watercolor? Is it some other way of acrylics? How do you do it all now?
I barely use a computer at all, actually. My artwork is all either watercolor or gouache paint, which is, if listeners don't know, it's very similar to watercolor, but it's more opaque.
Yeah.
So it gives you that sort of strength of color. But I just use the computer right at the end of the process because you have to kind of scan the images and send them off as digital files.
I did wonder that because having read the book, I finished it last night. I mean, there must be thousands of illustrations in there.
Yeah.
They're all to me, they look as though they must take a long time to do. So if you took a typical part of, say, one page, I'm looking at page 92 now, and there's a picture of the guy doing some farming on the bottom left of the page.
Yep.
What sort of length of time would that take to do?
So all the pages in the book basically appear in the originals as they do in the book, but they're about 50% larger. Yeah. So all the panels on any of the pages are arranged like that on the original page that was then scanned in.
Yeah.
So the whole double page spread, my sort of target when I'm working on a book like this is to do a double page spread every day.
Yes.
Which sort of I think all sort of graphic novelists have a different rate of speed that they work at. For some people, I tell people I do a double page spread every day, and some people are like shocked that I work so quickly, and other people are shocked that I work so slowly. So I think it really depends on the illustrator's individual approach. But yeah, I sort of just sit down every morning. I'll have already done the entire book in kind of a rough version. So there exists like the entire book drawn in really scratchy biro lines.
Yes.
So I've got a sense of the composition for each page and where the text will go and that sort of thing, where the panels will sit. But yeah, I sit down, when I was working on it, I'd sit down every morning, sort of 5 days a week, and try and do a double page spread. And then some take longer than others, but it more or less works out at that sort of speed. So there's also, sitting under my bed, there is a stack of all the original pages that's about 50 centimeters high or something, because they're all done on very thick paper as well.
Yeah. No, I have to say, I'm very impressed with the illustrations. They're very, very, they just... I'd never read a graphic novel before. Obviously, when I was younger, I read comics. So, I used to cartoon type stuff. And I'd never... I don't know whether a lot of listeners are like me, but I wondered what a graphic novel was. Was it something graphic? Was it violent or something like that? or I don't know. And it's opened my eyes to it. It's interesting because normally when you read a book, you sort of develop a picture in your mind, don't you, in terms of what the characters look like and all the rest of it. Whereas this is sort of done for you, and it's an interesting way of absorbing story, I think. Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting that it's funny that you say that about it being like graphically violent or something, because I have a similar thing where I tell people, I do graphic novels, and then they say, is that sort of like a teenage thing? And I go, it's kind of for adults. And they go, adult graphic novel. That sounds very saucy. And which it isn't at all. It's really, it's not adult at all in that sense. But then my publisher is based in America, and they're called Top Shelf Comics. Yeah. And to Americans, Top Shelf is like, it's on the top shelf because it's the best. And to Britain, it sounds like a top shelf magazine, like a pornographic magazine.
Yeah. Something seedy.
So it's a really seedy sort of, misassumption that some people make. But no, I mean, to my mind, the difference between graphic novels and comics is meaningless. It's really just it's a format. So some people would call what I do a comic, and some people would call it a graphic novel. And I don't tend to worry about splitting hairs between the definitions of the two terms. And I think, what I find really exciting about them is it almost sits between reading a sort of prose novel and watching a film, where you have as an author, you have the power to like sit your reader down and show them how things look, rather than leaving it up to their imagination. And also, it's sort of, I suppose, one of the things I always thought, it would be so interesting to be a film director. But I imagine as a film director, you have to collaborate and sort of not compromise, but you have to sort of work alongside and delegate to so many different people on the technical side and on the acting side and on the aesthetic side and everything. And as a graphic novelist, it's like you're making a film, but you just get to do everything yourself. You get to just micromanage the appearance of every character and what they're doing and how they're standing as they talk and how every scene looks. And I find that really fun because it allows me to sort of almost be a bit of a control freak.
Yeah, and also the level of detail and subtleness of some of the stuff in I'm just looking at one of the pages where you've got the people in the restaurant dining, and you've got the sort of waiter snobbishly walking around with his plate up in the air, and the level of detail to what they're actually eating as well, and glasses of wine half full, and the body language between the people. Yeah. So you can see somebody's on a first date here and all this sort of thing. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I do a lot of my kind of research almost comes from I just go out into town with a sketchbook and sort of draw whatever's in front of me. So I do a lot of drawing in cafes and bars and restaurants, which then informs a lot of these scenes. But actually drawing these big restaurant scenes is like one of my absolute favorite things to do in this book, to sort of show that, if any listeners are sort of avid people watchers and enjoy, going to bars and just sort of seeing what everyone else is doing. I find that really exciting. And that informed a lot of my sort of ambition behind the drawings.
Yeah, like I say, it's an interesting way of reading a story, and I think if people get the opportunity to read a graphic novel, and obviously the Delicacy,
Yeah.
or one of your other books, I think it's a great start. So, when did graphic novels themselves start? Is it fairly recent? Do you think?
I think there's been a big uptick in their popularity maybe over the last 20 years. I mean, there's a funny question about when, pinning a date on sort of the start of modern comics. Like Superman first appeared in 1938, I think.
Yeah.
But actually this sort of telling stories with pictures goes all the way back to the start. The people who would argue that, the cave paintings are, graphic storytelling or, visual storytelling. The Bayeux tapestry is like a really obvious sort of, it's from the 11th century, but it clearly is telling a story with words and pictures mixed together. And I quite like that sort of, I'm a bit sentimental about that sort of relationship to the past almost.
Yes.
Throughout the 19th and 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, there's this whole history of sort of caricature and people like George Cruikshank or Honoré Daumier illustrating and writing together as like political satire, which also ties in a lot to graphic storytelling. And I think also there was this sort of 19th century or earlier tradition of sort of chapbooks, which were these simply printed, sort of block printed books that would tell stories or tell the news to like peasants who maybe didn't know how to read and write. And so they'd have someone explain it to them with the help of these pictures that were printed in these books. So that would sort of, that's also an element of sort of that storytelling. And then, as I say, in the 30s, you sort of have the start of this like Superman, superhero comic tradition. And then I think up and throughout maybe all of the 20th century, but particularly recently, there's been an explosion in the popularity of, I suppose, the notion that like graphic novels can really do anything. They're not limited to a specific age range. They're not just for, say, kids or teenagers, and they're not limited to a specific genre. So they're not just for stories about superheroes or stories about sort of fantasy or sci-fi, but there's a big popularity of sort of books like Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, where she talks about her childhood growing up in Iran, or people like Alison Bechdel, who talk about sort of queer issues and social issues, and her own autobiography. Yeah. And I think there's this huge breadth of the kinds of stories that like the graphic novel format or the comic book format can be a medium for. Yes. And I think that's what's so exciting about being a graphic novelist now. And I think it also expands into being a world that is, because it's not strictly linked to genre, it becomes a world that is accessible to people with any sort of taste. So if you're a person who really likes films or doesn't read many novels, or if you're a person who loves reading novels and isn't really interested in films, for example, there's probably a graphic novel out there that will spark your interest.
Yeah, yeah.
And I guess, well, hopefully it's the Delicacy.
Well, absolutely. And I guess if you're an artist, it gives you an opportunity to actually produce a book.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always sort of semi-jokingly say that I wrote my first graphic novel, Her Bark and Her Bite, as just an opportunity to give myself something to illustrate. Like I just came to writing. In a way, I'd always written for my own sort of personal interest, but in a way I came to writing stories just so I had something to illustrate, which was, it's quite a fun opportunity for me, and it's a really nice sort of format to make things in.
Yeah. Can we talk about the Delicacy itself, please, James?
Yeah, absolutely.
I've just read the book, and we're not going to give any spoilers for any listeners that want to buy the book and have an exciting time reading it. But it's an interesting book. The Delicacy itself, it looks, when you first look at it, as a fairly sort of pleasant journey. But there's some really interesting twists and turns in it, aren't there?
Yeah. Well, so the story is two brothers, Tulip and Rowan, from the Hebrides, so the west coast of Scotland, decide to leave their little sort of slightly cloistered homestead that they grew up on and move down to London. They have this perception of London as being this horribly polluted, corrupted metropolis, and they want to open a restaurant, bringing the sort of wholesome, organic, natural approaches of Scottish cuisine to London as what they'll see as a kind of panacea of against the sort of pollution of the metropolis. So they're slightly kind of evangelical to begin with. At first, the restaurant isn't an enormous success, but then on the little bit of land where they start growing their market garden that's going to kind of support the restaurant kitchen, they discover these mushrooms that they can't identify, and they start realizing they're not poisonous. They start serving the mushrooms to the restaurant guests, and it becomes wildly popular. Tulip, the owner of the restaurant, loses his way in a sense. He loses his initial evangelical, wholesome, natural food inclinations as the restaurant becomes more and more successful. He becomes more and more wealthy, and he becomes more and more seduced by this sort of like glamorous gastronomic world, which causes a rift between him and his brother, and in turn opens a sort of plethora of darkness in his own personality and terrible secrets about their family.
Yeah, and like I say, I can thoroughly recommend it. It's absolutely fantastic. So where did you get the idea of the novel from? Where did the ideas of the two brothers, and because it's almost like a fable, isn't it?
Yeah, I really like that sort of almost fable approach to telling stories. I quite like. Interestingly, a little while ago, somebody asked me if it was a political book, and I sort of thought, and I don't mean to sound preachy, because I realize saying this might put people off. And like, it's not a political book, but it's kind of a moral book. It's like there's a clear. There's a sort of clear dynamic of like greed corrupting, and wholesome integrity versus corrupted greed, which is one of the elements. I think for me there were two main strands. It's partly I really like this, as I say, this sort of emotional conflict between two brothers, where one of them represents. They both have their flaws, but one of them represents a sort of maybe slightly old-fashioned and insular traditional integrity, and the other one represents this like glamorous urbane lifestyle of like wealth and gastronomy and driving flashy cars and like socializing with celebrities and things, and there's a conflict between them, between sort of selfishness and selflessness, which I think that to an extent everybody feels elements of that in their own personal contexts. And then the other side of it was really just as I say, I love drawing crowds, and I love the restaurant world. I find gastronomy and sort of restaurant cooking really interesting and delicious. And I really wanted to do a story about restaurants. I've got a few friends who work in the restaurant industry or own their own restaurants. So they were really generous in like helping me with a lot of research questions, letting me go into their kitchens and draw while the chefs are working and that sort of thing. So that was really good fun and a really interesting approach to the project. So it became natural to combine those two elements, to tell a story that takes place in restaurants and kitchens, but also tells a tale of greed and corruption.
James, it was good to see how the two brothers decided to leave the Northern Scotland islands. It was the Shetlands, wasn't it?
Well, it's the Hebrides, but it's a non-specific island in the Hebrides.
Yeah, okay. It was good to see how they were interested to leave, particularly Tulip. But the mother's an interesting character. Are you able to tell us a bit more about her?
Yeah, I think my notion for the family, the two brothers and their mother who's raised them, is that they've grown up on this. She's sort of a bit of a hippie and a bit of a sort of, she lives, outside, off the grid, as one might say. They live in a little sort of homestead, kind of small farm on their island. And she's very into, burning sage to purify the room and that sort of thing. And at the start of the story, I want her to be this sort of anchor that they have, that like, maybe the mainland is too polluted and corrupted. Maybe it's all concrete and nuclear power and the urban jungle will eat them. But they'll always have this home that's this like wholesome, natural little enclave that they can escape to. But as the plot develops and their relationship starts to crumble, they also find the flaws in their mother's lifestyle as well, that it's not just wholesome naturalism, but that she's also quite a kind of controlling person, and that she's also a person who maybe has a sort of rigid and prejudiced view of the outside world and of anything that doesn't sort of conform to her like naturalistic lifestyle. And I think for me that was quite an important counterbalance, because it's sort of easy in a low-hanging fruit to say like, oh, London is so, the big city, it's so nasty, it's so corrupt, oh, we don't need their fancy restaurants and things. But I thought it was important to balance that with the sort of the notion that what goes on in the countryside in a sort of like ostensibly wholesome world that's connected to the earth can still be disconnected from human beings.
Yeah. No, I thought that was quite interesting how you put that in. So,
Thanks.
in terms of if there's any listeners that would be interested in becoming an illustrator, what advice would you give them?
I think the biggest advice is draw as much as you possibly can, and draw the things, especially if one is, practically wanting to be an illustrator and wanting to put together their portfolio, draw the kinds of projects that you want to be commissioned on. I think that sort of, I've always found that sort of enjoyment of drawing is just so fundamentally important because, if you're setting up, probably any listener will be able to guess this, but if you're setting up to be an illustrator and sort of going into this realm, sometimes it can be, hugely rewarding in terms of external things, like, you can get quite nice lucrative jobs. You can get very prestigious jobs with very cool clients or very interesting stories. But sometimes you're just, because it's freelance, sometimes you have 3 months where you have nonstop jobs and it's really exciting. And then you have 3 months where just nothing comes in and you're just really sort of despondent and you think, what if I'm never going to get another job again?
Yeah.
And I think if you love drawing, then the drawing itself will see you through. You'll always be satisfied by the very act of drawing, even if you don't get that sort of external validation. Yeah. Whereas I think that if you don't have that sort of passion for drawing, I imagine that going through that sort of a period of sort of a barren period in one's professional life would be really, really depressing without that sort of external those external benefits. So I think that just drawing as much as possible, practicing drawing as much as possible, trying to sort of experiment and be free with one's drawings as well is really important, because to an extent, when you're doing commissioned work, clients are expecting you to produce work like what's already in your portfolio. But if in your personal work and the drawings you kind of do for yourself, if you're able to sort of free yourself and try new things and try different media and that sort of thing, that's where you can kind of keep that flame alive and sort of, keep that passion for drawing going.
Yeah, and I guess if you've got a side hustle, i.e. you're doing a graphic novel, as well as, and then that also. So in terms of a younger listener that perhaps at school still and they want to continue their drawing experience, would you recommend that they did go to study?
Yeah, that's almost a whole question in itself now, because I've recently been talking to a friend of mine who's a bit younger, who's thinking about going to art school. When I went to art school, which was more than 10 years ago, we had this great benefit that it was free, essentially, because I grew up in Scotland. I went to art school for free, which was amazing. Tuition fees are so expensive now. It's a different kind of ask to say that one should go to art school. I think that art school really gives you an experience like no other, that you really you learn so much and you're in such a sort of stimulating place when you're in art school. Yes. But then if you're asked to put like a 5-figure price tag on that, then maybe that's a little bit steep. And it's difficult. Maybe it's harder to sort of rationalize. I think if one decided not to go to art school, the best thing to do would be to be as focused as possible and draw as much as you possibly can, and sort of engage with as many extracurricular artistic activities as you could. Even if one doesn't go and do a full-time undergrad bachelor's degree in illustration, there's loads of sort of short courses and sort of a lot of free resources online, a lot of community kind of resources, a lot of, you can go and spend £5 and go and do an evening of life drawing and stuff. Yeah. And I think that one could substitute art school if one was really diligent and really sort of focused about always going to life drawing classes and always going and, taking part in sort of community briefs and that sort of thing.
Yes.
But overall, I probably err on recommending art school to people, even though I feel a little guilty about that, because obviously now a student would incur so much debt compared to the kind of debt that I had to pay off after when I graduated. So that is, so it is just broadly, I'd recommend going to art school, but it's a harder thing to recommend now than it probably was 10 years ago.
Yeah, and that sort of partly answered my second question I was going to ask, which was if there's any listeners perhaps who are later on in their years and they've been affected by the pandemic and they want to do something different and they've always liked drawing, perhaps that's something they could consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's never too late to start. And I mean, it's easy to say that as a platitude, but there's loads of now really, really successful illustrators. People like, if your listeners know a New York-based illustrator called Yuko Shimizu. She started illustrating when she was 40. She left a job in finance and became an illustrator, and she's incredible. She's really talented.
Yeah,
it's never too late to start illustrating. Whether one wants to do that in their own sort of personal life or build a career out of it, or any mixture between the two. I think that, you've just got to just keep drawing and just try and make your drawings improve a little bit every day. And that's all it takes, really.
And on the subject of graphic novels, are there any people who collaborate? So, for example, if, say, there was somebody who had good ideas for stories but they didn't consider themselves an artist, is there a way that they can collaborate with an artist and put the two?
Yeah.
Is that actually going on at all?
Yeah. There's a lot. I'd say there's for every kind of combined author illustrator, there's just as many duos of illustrators and authors working together.
That's interesting.
So yeah, I mean, people can approach it either way. I think you can either, if you know an artist or there's someone you want to work with, and you can approach them and sort of build the project from the ground collaboratively. That works really well. Or if you've got a really good script for a graphic novel and you send it to a publisher, the publisher will help to match you with an illustrator. So I think that either can work. But yeah, if one is a writer but not an artist, that shouldn't hold you back at all.
Yeah. Any ideas for your next book?
Oh yes, but they're secret.
Of course. Are you actually working on any at the moment?
Yeah. I am, but it's the thing is, it's as I say, these projects they take several years to complete, and this one probably is a little bit different and a little bit more elaborate than the previous ones. So it might not be done, for years and years and years. So I don't want to give anything away now, lest we have remarkable changes between now and then.
So, of course. So if somebody wanted to write a graphic novel, and based on your experience writing them, what do you wish you'd known before you'd started?
That's an interesting question. I guess there's nothing. I never had any moments of if only I'd known this before I started, sort of panic. But I think it confirmed a lot of the things. I think to an extent everyone has their own approaches, but I definitely found planning really, really important. My attitude towards making a book is to make the book in its vaguest sense first, and just make it more and more detailed until you have the finished book. Whereas I know some people just start writing a story on page 1 and just carry on going. So you 10 pages a day or something. Okay,
so you actually know what the premise is and what the story is and how it's going to end before you actually get right into it.
Yeah, absolutely. The best advice that my editor gave me was write the whole story as 1,000 words, just in one piece of paper. And if the story works in 1,000 words, it'll work in 10,000 words, or 100,000 words. So if you can make a consistent sort of beginning and middle and end, and have the end informed by the beginning, and have satisfying and dramatic resolutions for the characters in a very, very short basis, then it will work when it becomes longer and more elaborate. But if you don't sort of have, if it doesn't kind of balance out, or it doesn't work out in short form, then adding more and more sections won't make it more efficient. It'll just make it sort of more all over the place.
Yeah.
But a good editor should also be, very supportive in helping the writer sort of hone the story to make it efficient and exciting like that.
Sure.
But yeah, I definitely say to someone starting out, have a really good sense of what the story is about in 1 or 2 themes, and how the plot will work in about 1,000 words. And if you can do that, then everything else will fall into place and just become more and more exciting.
Yeah,
Whereas,
I guess that would apply to a traditional novel as well, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that element of those sort of principles of storytelling apply whether you're writing a graphic novel or a screenplay or a theatrical play, or anything. There's that notion that the story needs to have a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Yeah.
Is just essential. And then once those beginning, middle, and ends work cohesively, then the rest of the story can kind of be grown from there. Yeah.
Well, it's been really good talking to you, James. Where can people find out more about your work?
Well, you can find The Delicacy or any of my other books, A Shining Beacon or Her Bark and Her Bite, in basically any bookshop, your local independent bookshop. You can get them in, chain bookshops. You can get them on your favorite online retailer. My website is jamesalbon.com. My Instagram is jamesalbon.illustration. So if people want to have a look at my work there, then they're more than welcome to.
Well, that's great. It's been great talking to you. Thanks ever so much, James.
Hey, yeah, thank you very much.
You have been listening to Undercurrent Stories. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share the show link to your friends and family, and if you have 60 seconds, I would be most grateful if you would please rate and review. To hear more episodes, please subscribe to the show and visit undercurrentstories.com. If you leave your email in the link, we will notify you as soon as new episodes are released. Also, check out our social media links, details of which can be found on the show notes. Until next time, this is Bob Wells wishing you all the very best.